That is a text on education. This is the next great text on education and how we learn and what learning actually is. And in fact, my definition, which is of course the definition of many, that learning is this capacity to connect new information, old information, is profoundly Augustinian at its core. And so we're going to hear it here. By the way, ironically, he says he learned to pray for the first time in school, and his prayer was, "Don't let my teachers beat me." Back then, of course, corporal punishment was a project. But notice the point that's often made here. In the early years, St. Augustine is pointing out, when I prayed, I thought of God as something that does things for me, instead of later in my life, things that that I can do for God in the form of praise and worship and the like, right? By the way, he does point out as well in Book 1 that in many ways, kids are kind of like adults. Adults tell kids not to, for example, mess around and play. And yet Augustine points out that when you're a child and you look at adults, you recognize, well, their business is really just a form of play, isn't it? And in the end, all of what adults usually do in the form of business is something to keep them distracted from their search for God. Now, this notion of being distracted is going to be huge, so write this one down. Augustine is going to comment on the ways in which addiction is really a distraction. We distract ourselves in some way, which reminds us, of course, of that great T.S. Eliot line from Four Quartets, distracted from distractions by distractions. This will be in many ways a very Augustinian line that T.S. Eliot picked up on, right? One of the big concerns early in his life, he says in Book 1, is whether to be baptized or not. And we have the mention of Monica, his mother, who will say, no, let him go through the process of having all kinds of relationships, sexual especially, and then after all that's done, then we'll worry about marriage. And there will be a marriage that's actually planned, through Monica's help, for Augustine, and that's going to be a disturbing realization as well. But all of this is going to be for Augustine question. He says, you know, I'm a little bit concerned that I was allowed to have all of these experiences, and yet you kind of get a sense as well that he's saying, I'm kind of happy that it all happened the way it happened because I have a perspective that I can share with you, obviously through the Confessions. He does comment on learning languages. He likes Latin. He doesn't learn much Greek, and there's always been much debate about this. He also comments on his first interaction with Virgil's Aeneid, and it's a really popular line, a set of lines. So I'll share it with you. He says, "For those first lessons were better certainly because more certain. By them I obtained and still retain the power of reading what I find written, and myself writing what I will." We'll pause for a moment and point out that the one thing he says that was good about his education is he learned how to read and write. Obviously, we're reading a text that he wrote, and he wrote bunches of other texts. He was a prolific, a prodigious writer, especially once he converts to Christianity, right? He continues, "Whereas in the others, that other stuff that he said they were teaching me, I was forced to learn the wanderings of one Aeneas." In other words, it's almost like he doesn't even know who he's really trying. You know, oh yeah, there was this guy. I think his name was like Aeneas or something like that. Of course, this is a major kind of ironic line for us because, of course, all of the readers of Confessions will know who exactly he's referencing in Aeneas, and we will read the Confessions as a form of an epic of a type that follows, believe it or not, much of the trajectory of the Aeneid. For example, Aeneas will leave Troy and go where? To Carthage, which is of course where St. Augustine will go. And then after leaving Carthage, where does Aeneas go? To Italy. Where does St. Augustine go? To Italy, first to Rome and then to Milan, before finding his way back ultimately to North Africa. So he says, whereas in the others I was forced to learn the wanderings of one Aeneas, forgetful of my own, and to weep for dead Dido, the lover of Aeneas, because she killed herself for love. The while, with dry eyes, I endured my miserable self, dying among these things, far from thee, O God, my life. For what more miserable than a miserable being who commiserates not himself, weeping the death of Dido for love to Aeneas, but weeping not his own death for want of love to thee, O God. Now, this is an interesting idea, and it's one that early on he introduces, and then he's going to come back to it. By the way, Augustine will do this over and over again, where he kind of raises an idea, and then he kind of comes back to it again and again. And we'll come back to this notion of, really, I was studying about Aeneas, and I was sad, he says. I was so emotional and sad about, for example, the death of Dido, because the jilted lover, and she kills herself. And I wasn't sad for myself. In other words, the point here is that his education was not proper because it didn't teach him to seek for the right things. It taught him how to read and write, but it taught him how to read the wrong things and write about the wrong things, and to be consumed with something called rhetoric, which is, of course, learning how to talk so that you can make lots of money and be famous and all of that. Well, we finished now with this book. We're going to follow Augustine's life kind of the way we followed Aeneas's life. This will be, in many ways, a different, maybe we would say, kind of odyssey or journey, right? He comments on the best way to learn, not too much from force, and rather, he says, from a quest for joy, right? This is for Augustine a key concept. All of our learning, all of our seeking should ultimately end in Scooby snacks, to be happy, joy. And yet the question will be, what is true happiness? Of course, he's going to answer that question through the course of the Confessions as to find God. He mentions it in the opening lines of the text. This notion, though, of a different kind of quest, I think is significant. So let's write it down. And we will see this in lots of other texts at 3a as well, right? This notion that life is like a journey. Odysseus takes a physical journey to get back to Ithaca to be reunited with his Telemachus and Penelope. But it will be Augustine who will outright make the argument, life is kind of like a journey. And notice how Odysseus went through all these different kinds of temptations and that kind of thing. And Augustine will, in the Confessions, share what were those temptations? What was the stuff that he had to go through? Those addictions. He will say it ultimately this way. We're all going to be addicted to something. The question is, addicted to what? For Augustine, he was addicted to lust and sex early in his life, and later he came to discover it's much better to be addicted to something that leads to true happiness, not fleeting happiness. Right? He does learn to speak well, but they were empty words, he says. And then he will describe sinning already as a form of forgetfulness or being distracted, right? His education basically let him down. It didn't really help him in the things that matter. We turn now to Book 2. Well, in Book 2 we're going to see lots and lots of comments about sex and all kinds of immoral behavior of any number of kinds, right? We have an interesting story about his father who saw him at a bath. There's been much debate about exactly what's going on here, but saw him at a bath and realized that his son was growing into maturity and would soon make him, the father, a grandfather, right? And he was very excited about this. Augustine seems to be pointing out, notice, however, that it seems like all Augustine's father cares about is kind of promoting his son for the father's own self-interest. He says, it is true that my father sent me to good schools, but I kind of have the feeling that he did that so that I would become famous and possibly wealthy and maybe have sons and name one of my sons after him, and that was probably a more selfish interest on the part of my father. You also seem to have this suggestion, and fathers and sons are going to stand in the kind of the background of much of what's going on here. Of course, the penultimate father and son is God the Father and Christ the Son. But we're going to have this notion that sometimes he says, my father should have probably guided me better spiritually, morally, religiously, that kind of thing. And he didn't, right? The father loves, Augustine loves to brag to his friends about sex and having sex. And this will be one of those kind of common motifs that friendships have a tremendous influence on Augustine and his life, right? And then we have in the second book the famous stealing of the pears story. Well, what is this all about? Well, Augustine tells a story. He says, let me tell you how bad I actually was. I snuck with my friends into a neighbor's garden, and I picked from the pear tree a bunch of pears. Didn't want the pears, wasn't even hungry really, just knew that I wasn't supposed to do it, and my friends told me that we should do this, so I did it. We ended up even throwing some of the pears to the pigs. Now this scene bothers Augustine a lot. Now lots of readers have said about this scene, are you serious with me? I mean, come on, Augustine, get over yourself. It's not really a sin to steal some pears. But Augustine says, no. The reason why it's a sin is that I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I did it anyway, and I didn't even really have much of a good reason to be doing it, other than I was told not to do it. I was told to stay out of the garden. And my friends were the ones leading me there. Now let's just point out, we got some really important motifs that are going to come back later in this text for us. For example, Gardens are going to be very important in Christian theology, as we know from our study of Milton's Paradise Lost. It is the Garden of Eden in the Genesis 3 story where all of that action takes place. Of course, we're going to have a garden story as well later in Book 8, because that is where we're going to have the conversion experience happening along with trees. Here it's a pear tree. Later it will be a fig tree where Augustine will find his conversion experience. Okay, but notice the psychology of it. For Augustine, he's very interested in this. He asks this question over and over again. Why did I want to sin? And the sociological observation. I did this because I loved being with others and my friends, and if I had been alone, I probably wouldn't have done it. He makes the observation that true friends don't make you do what you don't want to do, right? In Book 3, we then turn to the famous lines, "To Carthage then I came," and we're again kind of modeling this movement after Virgil's Aeneid, right? And again, I've already mentioned T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and the Fire Sermon lines as well. Well, what is Carthage? Well, it's Sin City. There's no question. And it's here he says, I loved the city. Why? Because I loved sex. I loved hooking up with people and having exchange of fluids. I loved it, he says. And he takes a number of lovers, and yet he admits it out loud. He's constantly tormented. So, for example, if he's with somebody, he's always wondering if that somebody is, when he's not with them physically, is with somebody else. And he says, I was just kind of led around by my twisted psychology, and the beginnings of the addiction to sex begin here for him. Also, he points out that he loves the theater and he loves the tragedy of the theater because it taps into the emotions. We immediately think of our comments from Aristotle and the Poetics. The idea of the catharsis that Aristotle talks about, for St. Augustine, he says, that I was a very emotional guy anyway, and I was very much tied in with all of the acting and the storylines and all of that kind of stuff. He goes on to study law. He's great at it, but he points out that the minute you get good at something, you kind of get conceited about it. In other words, pride kind of comes in. However, Book 3 is really important because he tells us that it's at this point in his life that he meets Cicero, the great Roman orator from the 1st century BCE, and his classic text of that time, Hortensis. Now, sadly, we don't actually have this text extant today, so we can't pick up Cicero's Hortensis and read it. We can pick up other things of Cicero and read it. For example, Cicero will be given a volume in the Harvard Classics, right? But the important thing here is that so much of Augustine's life starts with a book. Now, I want to point out how significant it is to see Western civilization as in many ways Augustinian civilization. Because Western civilization is Christian civilization, and if it's Christian, it's Catholic. And if it's Catholic, it's primarily St. Augustine. And what is it that St. Augustine says started it all? A book. He picks up Hortensis. And what is it that he gets from it? Cicero challenges him to find the life of philosophy. Not the life of the body, not the life of lust and the addictions to lust, but the life of the mind and philosophy. And Augustine says, the match was lit, the fire was set, and from that point on in my life, he said, I longed for knowledge. For those of us that have ever had a great teacher, I've mentioned in earlier lectures, one of the great professors of my life was a Dr. Robert Lawrence of York College, and he turned that on in me. Any of us that have had that experience, right, come back to this reading of Book 3 and go, totally know what you're talking about. Kind of wandering around, not really finding my way very well. Read a book, and all of a sudden, my life took off. One of my students once told me, kind of understand that because I picked up that classic little fable book called The Alchemist. I read it, and it changed forever the way I thought about the world. Other students have said the same. Talk to any great writer, and they usually will say, he or she will say, it was a book that kind of turned me on, and then I was off and I was running, I was doing amazing things. By the way, in Book 3, very brief comment, at 19 years old, his father dies. And to that degree, it's kind of like, we're going to hear more about this later in his father, but it's kind of like just a side note that there he is, he's left to try and figure stuff out, right? He tries reading Scripture, we're told, because he's been reading Cicero, but he's very arrogant about his view of Scripture. Now, think about this. The greatest interpreter of Christian Scripture will admit that before the age of 20, when he picked up the book and read it, he wasn't impressed. Why? Because it was such simple language. Compared to the Latin that he was reading in Cicero, for example, it was so simple and so kind of beneath him. He's so arrogant and conceited that when he looks at Christian theology through the scriptures, he kind of makes fun of the whole thing. It's beneath him. So he falls in with a group of thinkers called the Manichees. Now, these are an interesting group. They're kind of a philosophic group. They're a group of dualists. That is to say, not that they go out and shoot duels, but they see everything in dualistic fashion. So, for example, all of the world is understood as basically having been created by two distinct gods. One a good God, one a bad God. Light versus darkness, the whole thing, right? This is a philosophy for elitists, and there seems to be as well a certain kind of understanding of a certain type of life that you're supposed to lead. Although, Augustine will say, I continue to lead a certain kind of sexual life as well, right? One of the questions that the Manichees will resurrect and make fun of Christian theology for is the question about a personal God. In other words, does God have fingernails? Is a classic example question that Augustine said. And he said, I used to love those kinds of questions, and I would kind of button the hole of Christians, and I would ask them these questions. Oh, you believe in a personal deity. Does this deity, this sky daddy of yours, have certain kinds of physical attributes? Blah, 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 blah. He's really making a point that before I understood, I saw God anthropomorphically, and he said, I realized that was a wrong way to be thinking about God. Later, he would come to a metaphysical, non-physical understanding of God. And he said, I just didn't see it at the time. His mother, as you can imagine, is really worried about her son. And in fact, she has dreams, for example. She's standing on a ruler, and she's there with her son. And how do we interpret this kind of thing? And ultimately, she goes to a bishop, and she's concerned about her son. And oh, good heavens, he's having all of these relationships, and you know, he's not a Christian, and he won't be a Christian, and he's making fun of the Bible and religion and all of that. And I'm crying all the time. At the very conclusion of Book 3, there's an interesting set of lines. Let me read them. The bishop will say back to her, which, when he had said, and she would not be satisfied, but urged him more with entreaties and many tears, that he would see me and discourse with me. The bishop said, all right, I'll talk to your boy. He, a little displeased at her importunity, because she kept saying, please, please, you have to talk to my boy, said, go thy ways, and God bless thee, for it is not possible that the son of these tears should perish. End quote. Which answer she took, as if she often mentioned in her conversations with me, as if it had sounded from heaven. Go thy ways. It's not possible that the son of these tears should perish. I can't tell you the number of mothers who have taken comfort, from, and fathers, quite frankly, too, the number of mothers who have taken comfort from these lines, who themselves are practicing Christians and have sons and daughters who are not, or once were and no longer are, who come to these lines with tremendous comfort. That's why Augustine wrote them, because what's he saying at the conclusion of the third book? He's saying, look, I was as far away from God, Christian theology, a practicing Christian, belief in the church, as anyone ever could have been. And it was, Augustine will imply and say directly, it was the prayers of my mother that finally led me ultimately to seek refuge in God. Well, we continue now with book 4, and he's with the Manichees. And he likes the Manichees. He's there with them from age 19 to 28. So let's put this in our notes. Long before he's a Christian, St. Augustine will spend a lot of time with this non-Christian group, a group that actually ridicules Christian theology, although associating certain kinds of Christian ideas with it, right? He also, we're told, associates with astrologers, and he begins to kind of question the astrologers, because he points out the problem with astrology is that it's kind of linked to fate. Your fate is determined in the stars. And Augustine is a huge believer in free will. Let's write this down. If Milton will argue his theodicy is built around free will, as we say in our lectures on the Harvard Classics about Milton's Paradise Lost, all of that is derived from his reading of St. Augustine, because Augustine is a huge believer in free will, right? Which is why he begins to have his problems already with astrology. But we have a very interesting story, by the way, pointed out. In each one of the books, it seems that we have a key or a cardinal story. There are a number of them, obviously. But it's always like one central story that kind of defines the book. And in book 4, we have a very interesting story. Augustine talks about friendship. And he talks about this friend that he had. And he's really close to this guy. I mean, they're like pals through and through. And he gets sick. And he begins to die. And while he's unconscious, they baptize him. Not Augustine. He can't believe that this is happening. And when his buddy all of a sudden miraculously comes back, whoa, it looks like he's going to be well and everything's going to be great. Augustine kind of laughs with him about being baptized. He's shocked. His friend says, don't make fun of him. I'm a believer now. And Augustine's like, what? What are you talking about? A few days later, this now true believer, his illness returns and he dies. Tragically, he dies. And it's in this moment that some of the most profound language of grieving you have ever read will be produced in Confessions. Augustine, later in his life, tries to capture what it was like in his youth to lose his best pal. Any of us that have lost a close, a dear friend, a relation maybe, know what it means to hear the words that Augustine will share. At this grief, my heart was utterly darkened, and whatever I beheld was death. My native country was a torment to me, and my father's house a strange unhappiness, and whatever I had shared with my friend, wanting him, became a distracting torture. Mine eyes sought my friend everywhere, and he was not granted my eyes. And I hated all places, for that they had not him, my friend. Nor could they now tell me, he is coming,